Going to discuss issues towards genomic evaluations of resilience and efficiency. I don't know where that talk comes from. That's you got that, Nick. All right. So in this session, we are going to hear some presentations, and you can see them here. So we are going to start with a presentation more generally about crossbreeding, and Emre is going to discuss some of these multi-breed models. And you may ask yourself in the beginning, okay, why does this crossbreeding really fit into the program where we're talking mainly about efficiency and resilience? And we're going to make sort of the argument, at least, that crossbreeding as such is one tool to improve efficiency and resilience, both on the animal, but also on the herd and system level. There's a lot of things in there, and I thought, okay, maybe I'll say something about that, but it's much better to have Morten to do that. I know no one who is more enthusiastic about crossbreeding than Morten. So then Emre is going to show, really some of these novel models in multi-breed, admixed breed, crossbreeding, genomic evaluations. And he's going to show a little bit about both in terms of, well, probably mainly in simulations, but also a little bit alluding to real data analysis, why this is more efficient, superior, when it is and when it maybe isn't. And after that, we're going more specifically into the traits of efficiency and resilience. And in this case, it's really work that's very tightly related to what is going on in work package 2. So the models and Nick was telling a little bit about, and actually Didier presenting this morning, about what's going on there in work package 2. Here we are going to add on the genomic parts on that. And then in the end, Donna is going to say something about improving decision support tools by using some of these genomic information. So really, while the core of this may be related to work package 4, it's really many links to the other work packages. And maybe I could mention, I think actually we are missing maybe a little bit the link to work package 3 about the deviations from the lactation curves as a measure could be a nice add-on later on. But maybe it can be part of the discussion. All right, so with this, I would just like to invite Morten to give the first presentation.
Yes. There's some light here. Maybe I'll go over here. Yeah. Thank you very much. Can you hear me, see me? Yeah, that's possible. So crossbreeding and resilience and why genomic breeding values are needed in this situation. Yeah, then maybe better here. Is that okay? Yeah, we'll see that if that works. I think what I'll try to say, what can crossbreeding offer in relation to resilience, robustness, and methane efficiency, and why is then afterwards, why is it better breeding values, genomic breeding values for crossbred animals needed? Management in dairy herds, it's a lot of things. You can, it's roughids, feeding, roughids, buildings, technology, breeding, and other decisions. And this is from, the change can be done over weeks when you do feeding. And if it's roughids feeding, it takes 1 to 2 years. If it's buildings and technology, it can be done within months, but some of them takes, they are there for 30 years. When it's breeding, then it's around 3 to 7 years. That's what, then we can sort of change the herd. And this is also holds for crossbreeding, or if you change to another breed. So just about here, that all of you know, but I put it in there, the principles of heterosis is that you have 2 breeds, one to the left and one to the right, and then the average of these breeds and what the animal perform above the average, it's heterosis. And it's often, you see most heterosis for robustness traits like fertility, calf survival, calving ease, and health resistance. That's heterosis, and that can be used for improving the economy of the herd, but also it can be used for improving resilience, robustness, and methane emission. That's at least what I'll try to show here. So we know that it works for robustness, but in fact, we have never tested whether it works for resilience. So I put a question mark there, but my hypothesis will be that it works. Resilience at herd level. I think it's important to see how resilient is the herd. So it is, what is important in that sense is to use the breed with the right forces for the specific production systems. And for that, we can make use of crossbreeding, and we can use the breed complementarity, and we can use heterosis for doing that. And I have just shown you then some examples on heterosis and breed differences. Here you see some estimates for heterosis for survival to second and third lactation. It's Sweden's results, and it shows that crosses between Swedish Red and Holsteins, they are there. You see heterosis for survival to second and third lactation or parity calving. That means that survival is heterosis worked in relation to survival. The next one here you see it's Friends results, where you see that the Montpellier breed, this is deviations from Holsteins. You do see that the Montpellier breeds, they lag behind when it comes to, does this pointer work? Yeah, when it comes to fat and protein yield. But coming then on the conception rate there, the Montpellier is much ahead of the Holsteins. But when coming to, and that's the interesting thing, coming to the crossbreeds between Holstein and Montpellier, then the level of yield is the same as the Holsteins, and exactly the conception rate is more or less the same as the Montpellier. So in this situation here, you have got the best from both breeds. And here you have see some pictures. You see the differences. This is Montpellier, and this is a cross between Montpellier and Holstein. And you see they are a bit less meaty than the Montpellier. Then we have some Danish results from Julia sitting just in front of me. This is there we tried to see, are the heterosis the same in high, average, and low management systems? And overall, we saw that that was the case. And you see here that the mastitis, that's the incidences of mastitis, is lower in all, both in high, average, and maybe not as much in low, but at least in high and average, the mastitis resistance is lower in the crossbred animals. And again, as before, you see that the survival to second and third calving is also much higher for the crossbred animals. So crossbreeding is a way to improve the health, resistance, and the survival for within the herd. And here are some US results where you see this is the residual feed intake, where you see that the blue dots are that should not have happened. The blue dots are the Holstein, and the brown dots are the crossbred. And since we want the residual feed intake to be as low as possible, then we see that the crossbred animals have a better feed efficiency or residual feed intake than the Holsteins in these trials in Minnesota. So there's many. So in many ways, it seems as though that the crossbred animals, they perform well when it comes to improved feed efficiency. I've not talked at all about methane emission yet, but I would think also it works for resilience then. Then we have some ongoing results in Denmark where we have some crossbred animals in trails. Here you see the growth rate for the Holsteins, and they are fed on different ratios. There's a normal ratio here, the blue one, which is fitted for the Holstein, and then there's a more Rufford-based ratio. Then you see the Holstein, when they are fed on a more Rufford-based ratio, then they grow less. It's in the period from 4 to 12 months. And you see that the reds, they are here, they grow exactly the same, whatever they are fed. And the crosses, they are something in between, a little bit nearer to the reds. So again, also for that trait grows, there is a crossbreeding has an effect. And the thing is that we have also calculated the feed efficiency. It's more or less the same, but the reds and the crosses, they are able to grow on a more roughet-based ratio. So they can eat more roughet and grow the same as the Holstein on a more concentrate-based feeding. Then coming to some crossbreeding systems, then you know all these systems. The most used one is the rotational crossbred, where you go around, or you could use this we call combi cross, we have used in Denmark, Sweden, and to a certain degree in Finland, where you have a nucleus of a purebred hare, and then you cross on another dairy breed and have some F1 cows, which are very good for producing. And here you use sex semen both for the nucleus, both the purebreds and for this, both there. And then you have some F1 cows, and you use sex semen from another dairy breed, have some 3-course cows. And since you've used a lot of sex semen, then all these cows can be inseminated with a terminal bull, beef bull, and then for making some better beef production. That, in fact, can work quite well. But what is the effect of that in different herds? For that, there is in animal science in Denmark, they have developed a model or program called SimHerd, where you can investigate what are how does trait behave when you do changes within the herd, and you can also see what happens if you put in another herd, or not another breed in the herd, or you start using crossbreeding. And each animal in the herd is simulated individually, and we give them genetic levels and heterosis effect depending on the breed composition. So by that we can investigate different crossbreeding programs, and the output is annual net return, but you also have an output on both milk yield, fertility, replacement rate, etc. for the herd. And I'll show you a few of these results. And of course, for that we need a lot of input. Here we have just an example on the input we have for the breed estimates, and we have exactly the same for the heterosis estimates. And this is of course based on literature, so we have to do a literature research to put into as starting variables for SimHerd crossbred. And that we have used quite some time on. I think you agree, Julia, that we have done that. Now I'll show you what happens here when we have SimHerd crossbred. We have simulated an average Holstein herd with 200 cows. What happens in case we over time change this? We have exactly the same management system, but we put in the red breed to change the breed from Holstein to red, or change it from Holstein to Jersey. And then you see that the yield in India-corrected milk goes a bit down, especially for the Jerseys. But at the calving interval does as well, which is positive, and the replacement rate goes down quite a bit, and the number of treatments per cow goes very much down, and the annual net return, it's nearly the same, a little minus for the Jersey and a little plus for the Nordic Red. But the net return per kilo of India-corrected milk is a bit improved. So just to say, by changing breed, then you really can change on some of these different traits within the herd. And coming to this, I'll come back to this, having a lower replacement rate means that you do not need to have that many heifers. And these are sort of disasters when it comes to the climate impact. The fewer heifers you can have, the better. Also, also what I put in here, it is that we have some economical equal breeds, and that's good, because if our breeds are too different when it comes to economy, then no one will start crossbreeding, because then the heterosis is not able to keep up with the lower additive level from one of the breeds. So it's important to have more or less equally breed, and that we show here, that the Jerseys and the Nordic Red are at present more or less economical equal to the Holstein. And then it's the same I've shown here. This is what happens if we start to do some crossbreeding between, this is in this case here, between the Reds and Montbéliard. So Holstein, red, Montbéliard. And you see here when doing that, there is a slight decrease, both when it's rotational crossing or combi cross, a slight decrease in milk yield. But the conception rate is improved a lot for the crosses compared to the Holstein. And also the replacement rate is much lower. And the treatment costs per cow is also much lower, meaning that the health data of these crossbred herds here are better than the purebred Holstein. And coming to the annual net return, then you see that the annual net return are better for the crossbred, and also the net return per kilogram of ND-corrected milk. I have set this in euro. This is maybe cent, could be. Yeah. And then what happens? What about then the methane? The methane emission. We have shown that the crossbreeding they can compete when it comes to herd health and fertility and longevity, and which gives us fewer replacement heifers, and also on herd net return. And they have shown from US that they are more efficient, but at least in Europe so far we have not seen these results, at least not in the northern part of Europe. So we have then made some sort of guesses on what would happen with the methane emission. This was done by Ruth Davis at EAP last year. So here you see, this is more or less the same figures as I showed you before, a little bit different assumptions, start assumptions, but more or less the same, a little less in 2- and 3-way crosses in yield, much better replacement, and the young stock survival, that I'll put in here. The young stock survival, or not the young stock survival, but the number of young stocks are much lower. In these simulations, we have done it in such a way that we have calibrated the herd in such a way that we use as much beef semen as possible. So the young stock herd here is lower. And what I should say here, then you see that the methane emission per kilogram of ND-corrected milk is a bit lower in the 2-way crosses and the 3-way crosses. In fact, it's 4 to 5% lower than in the Holstein herd. And we discussed this yesterday, Mogens. Why is that? And it is because here we are able to have this yield here, which is nearly the same in the crossbreed as in the Holstein, with fewer heifers, and this gives us lower methane emission per kilogram of milk, which is nice. And here we see what happens then in case this was with this. The results before were with no heterosis for feed efficiency. If there was 2.5% heterosis for feed efficiency, 5, 7.5, or 10, then the results would have been like this. These were the results you saw before. There was a reduction here on 4%. If heterosis is larger, then of course the gain in methane, in reduced methane emission, will be larger. And here for the tri-rotational cross from Montbéliard, RDC, and Holstein, it is like 2.5% lower compared to 20%. So it's more than 10%, 12% lower the methane emission from that herd. Then there is, of course, an interest. I'm quite soon finished, Mogens, so I'll do it in time. An interest in climate, it has increasing dramatically. And then one could consider, one could look at cars. What is a good way of, is it moving persons fast in this car and all the goods there, or driving a Peugeot partner? I do this, I know it can handle a lot, both persons and goods. I think this pattern may be preferred. Maybe the same with beef and milk. So here in the upper, we produce the milk on jerseys and there's no meat, and then produce the meat on the Charolais. Maybe we should combine it in a dual purpose cow. This may be preferred, because in case we produce the meat here, the climate impact per kilogram of meat is much, much lower than this. So in case by doing this, we can reduce the number of suckler cows, which will have a dramatically impact on the climate impact from cattle overall. So I'm a bit hard on the beef cattle here, but if the cattle sector are gonna reduce, it's a really smart thing to avoid a lot of these suckler cows. If we, under Danish circumstances, can improve the beef production from dairy with 10%, keeping the same level of milk, then we can reduce the number of suckler cows, and we will be able to reduce the CO2 equivalents from Danish cattle production with 250,000 tons of CO2, which is corresponding to nearly 2% of the CO2 emission from Danish agriculture. This comes on top of what I presented before, because I think those breeds which are often used for crossbreeding are often more dual purpose than the Holstein and the Jerseys. So we have we'll get something there which was not included in the figures I showed you before. Then nearly to the end, this is some of Julia's results again, the effect of crossbreeding on herd performance. Here you see, in this situation, Julia simulated some Holstein herd, a rotational crossbreeding between SRB, Swedish Red, and Holstein, and a terminal crossbreeding between, this is a terminal crossbreeding with only 2 steps, so there's only a nucleus of purebred Holstein and then some F1 crosses, and then these F1 crosses are inseminated with beef. And because we have only 2 steps, the amount of crossbreds is only approximately 1/3 here. But you see here that we also use some beef semen. Here you're able to use 10% of beef semen for the cows, and in the rotational you can use much more, and also in terminal crosses. And again you see that the milk goes down a little bit, but not that much, but all the functional traits increase. The replacement rate here goes down with nearly more than 9%. And again, the economy is improved as well. What then you tried also, Julia, was to see what are the net consequences of DABVs in crossbred herds. And for that, we need combined SimHerd with the population simulation, breeding scheme simulation program, ADAM. And we then try to see how much can we enhance the outcome by doing that. Again, we had a terminal cross breeding strategy with a nucleus of Holstein and some F1s here, and then on these F1s we use beef on dairy. Here you see there's only 1 step. We do not have some 3 crosses here. What? Yes, and you had this moment also before. The problem is that for now we do not have any DABVs for these crossbred cows here. So the simulations which was carried out here was only with DABVs on these animals here, and of course this bull as well, but on this female here. So we were able to select the best female for the nucleus and the lowest ranking for the to be mothered for the F1s. But if this has been a rotational crossbreeding system, then it would have been that we did not have any DABVs on these animals for deciding which ones should have had a beef bull and which ones should produce the next generation of replacement heifers. But in this situation here, it's not that bad. But this is just how we have it's done. We have this nucleus, and the younger generations in this nucleus are used for purebreeding, or the younger with the highest ranking animals are used for purebreeding, and the older generations of these are used for crossbreeding. This is how it works. And what then, if we see the results here, then we see here, this is the a purebred herd, and this is a purebred herd where we use genomic test. In that case, we increase the outcome with the 10,000 kroner at that herd level. And if it's crossbred herd, then we increase also a bit. But we see when coming to starting to use sex semen, here we use 50% of sex semen for the heifers, and here we use 6 semen for 90% of the heifers and 45% of the first parity cow. In that case, the effect of crossbreeding, both in purebreds and in crossbreeding schemes, tend to increase. So there's a positive interaction between using DABVs on the animals and using sex semen and beef semen. But in this situation here, you have to remind me, have to remind you that we did not have GABVs for the crossbred animals. So in case we have had this, then it would, at least in a rotational cross, have been good. This leads me to the conclusion that for crossbreeding systems within herds, crossbreeding systems within herds, then if these are going to be more efficient, then we need breeding values for the crossbred females. It's the crossbred bulls we do not use at all, because we do always use in the crossbreeding system, we do always use purebred bulls. But we need breeding values for the crossbred females until this era of Gentor, and we do also in Denmark have a product called Dairy Cross, which work on the same thing. You are in charge of that, Jørgen. We have only few traditional crossbreeding EBVs available, but with Gentor, genomic breeding values will become a reality, and that will be good for these systems. And I hope that I have convinced you a bit that these crossbreeding systems can help us in relation to feed efficiency, methane emission, and I have not said anything about resilience, but my hypothesis is that it will work there as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morten. A quick question to Morten. I mean, now it's either Morten convinced you that crossbreeding is really will bring more efficiency and resilience, or you have to ask the question now, otherwise you just accept.
Maybe I'll speak up.
Yeah, maybe you need actually. Yeah, I guess. Will you?
So, Morten, what would you be trying to predict in a genomic evaluation for crossbred animals? Only the additive part, or additive plus dominance? What's your ultimate goal?
You can hear me, or yeah, thanks.
It's for online.
Yeah, for online, yeah. Okay, my goal will be to say that we could talk about the breeding values is used to decide which one are we gonna inseminate with beef, and which one are we gonna inseminate with a dairy bull to create some replacement heifers. And then we could have a production worth. One could call the first one I'll call a breeding worth, a breeding value, and a production worth where I create a production value telling where you combine the additive value and the heterosis. And this one can be used for saying which of the cows should I keep for as production animal. If I have 2 or 3 cows and I have to sell one of them, then I should sell the one with the lowest production worth. So I would say we have a breeding worth and a production worth. This is what they work with in New Zealand as well. And then we could, for the different crossbreeding systems, we could talk about a herd worth, which is based on these similar crossbred analysis. And it would be very interesting to expand these analysis with some life cycle analysis, to where we also maybe include the feed, because these crossbred animals may be able to eat more roughnecks, and so the life cycle analysis would be very valuable in that sense.
Yeah, so I think I'm just about ready to be convinced with your crossbreeding arguments. In the rolling, very small hills in Denmark, where the environment is not that severe, but compared to the traditional breeds, when you go up into harsh environments, up into the mountains, are we still getting the same effects, or do the traditional breeds that have come from those environments have something which you'd actually lose in the crossbreeding?
Yes, I think you're totally right that you may lose something there, but then you should just find 1 or 2 breeds which are fitted for these circumstances and use them. I was talking with a man only producing milk on grass. He had a crossbreeding system with Holstein, Red, and Jersey, and I argued to him, are you sure you need the Holstein in your crossbreeding system? It's like driving a Tesla in an area you're only allowed to drive 50 kilometers an hour. So you have to also be very careful in which breed you use in the specific environment. I think that breeds, we have to be more aware of of the breeds in relation to the environment. And this is what we are talking about here, about resilience. So it's so interesting.
Is there a possibility to validate your models with real data in the long term?
We have not done this because it's difficult, but it will require quite a big research trial. But it would be so interesting to do because, but looking at results from when we have compared how the crossbred animals do under Danish circumstances, then it's quite alike of what we expect about based on these simulations. But we have not done it in specific herds, which would be very to set up sort of a trail there.
My question was on one of the slides you showed the crossbreds ate less for the same amount of milk, but that didn't seem to be included in your carbon footprint analysis when you showed that it was basically the efficiency that was driving the lowering of carbon footprint.
No, they had the crossbred had this lower methane emission per kilogram of milk. This was primarily, or is primarily, due to the fact that in that herd they do not need that many replacement heifers.
My question was, on the first slide, when you showed the crossbreds in the States, you showed that the crossbreds, albeit at the same production levels, were eating less, it had less intake. Yes. So wouldn't that also create a carbon benefit?
It will, and yeah, that's for sure. So the figures given here, they are sort of underestimated, and that was why we tried to see what will happen in case we had a heterosis of 2.5% or 5% or 7.5%. So, but we do not know the level, and that's why we have tried to have this trial in Denmark, try to dig a little bit into that.
All right, thanks, Morten. For the online. So since we are all now convinced crossbreeding is important, and we need this genomic evaluation for crossbred emerald, please, this is your turn. And if there's any energy in the end, we can keep on discussion, but Emrah.
Okay, now I can hear myself. So I'm not sure if we all have an agreement of what is resilience or how do we measure resilience. But I think that Morton-like people are so convincing that we will have more crossbred animals data in the future. So, So then we have actually two open questions: that how to evaluate these crossbred animals, or can we even make use of the data of crossbred animals so that we can actually increase the number of data we have. So in this, in work package 4, task 4.1, we were working on models which can handle the data of multiple pure breeds, as well as the data from crossbred individuals or mixed individuals. So we try to address the two questions: that if we can efficiently use the data from crossbred animals, and if we get more accurate predictions for these animals than in the current practice. So when you have a purebred population, you actually have the reference, and you have the, say, the test animals or the validation animals, and between these two populations, you have actually the linkage disequilibrium or the LD structure that is pretty consistent. But when you just simply combine all these data, or all data from these different breeds, you actually rely on not just the, you actually rely on a multi-population LD, and actually this is suboptimum for each of the breeds that you have in your population. And in most of the cases, it's not really helpful to just combine all these data. And actually, we don't need to think about just at the SNP level. We can just think it at the QTL level. And what is a breed? To my understanding, just to call a bunch of animals as breeds, then we need to see some differences at the genome level. I can say that there need to be some differences, at least at the allele frequencies of these animals, or of these breeds. So the genetic background of these animals are different, or these breeds are different. So all the QTL that interacts with these genetic background will have different effects, actually. And adding SNPs to this equation will not just simplify things, it will just make it worse, because LD is not perfect. So it is better to assume, actually, when we are using the data from multiple breeds and crossbred animals, it is so logical to assume that the effect of the SNPs or effect of the QTL, so the effect of the SNPs are different. And maybe, depending on the relation between the breeds, they can be also correlated. So there were some attempts to use this kind of, or to use the data from crossbred animals in multiple breeds, in a sense. So you can simply just use the breed proportions and account for the interactions between sorry. What? I think it seems similar to Danish. Yeah. So we can just use the breed proportions, like was done in this study, and look at the interactions between SNP effects and interactions, so that you can estimate different SNP effects for each of the breeds. Or if you don't want to deal with the data from crossbred animals, you can just get your SNP effects from purebred evaluations, and you can again use the breed proportions such that you estimate like breed-specific breeding values weighted by the breed proportions simply, and you can have estimates for your crossbred animals. But one problem with all these, or several others, with this kind of approach, is that you assume that breed proportion is consistent over the whole genome. And actually, for the admixed individuals, it's not the case. So we have an example here, which Anna did the work. She's sitting there. So we have this global breed proportion, but if we look at individual animals, then you can see that it's pretty different which chromosomal segment is coming from which breed. So it's not really a good idea just to assume that the global breed proportion holds for all animals or holds for all genome regions. So, as we have seen previously, the pattern of admixture is very different for each individual, depending on the ancestors or depending on the crossbreeding system. So earlier it was shown that it is useful to account for breed origin of the alleles when you do the genomic predictions for crossbred animals. And if I just go back, for instance, if we look at here, you can see that this part is 100% Swedish, but the rest is 100%, I think, Finnish. But if you just don't take into account these properly, you can say that it's 50% for both sides, and it's not even close. Something that is 100% you take as 50% for both sides. So we hypothesized that if we can account for breed origin of the chromosomal segments or each alleles, we can improve the prediction accuracy for both purebreds and for crossbred animals. So we did a simulation study for that. I'm just not going to give all the details, so it's just a part of the study, not the whole set of simulations. But we used instead of starting from scratch, we used real data from these three breeds, and we simulated genotypes and phenotypes for 9 generations, where we had 2 large breeds, say, and a small breed. And we applied a rotational crossbreeding system. We tried to mimic what is there in the Procross system. So we started with Jersey male and Holstein female, not exactly the breeds, but Jersey male and Holstein female. And then we continued with Red, Holstein, and Jersey in the same order for 9 generations. And we simulated a trait with heritability of 0.4 and with a correlation of 0.5 between the breeds. And we did it for 10 times. So we applied here basically two models. One is a very traditional model that you can call it as SNP-lab, or equivalently you can write it as GBLOB, where you just combine all available data. Or you can apply a breed origin model where you have actually a specific component for each of the breeds that you have in your population, or each of the breeds that is in the gene pool of your data set. And we just count the number of reference allele, whatever that is, and put it in these matrices. But more detail, you can just read the full article. So we followed several approaches for prediction. For the reference data, we had purebreds, or like many people does, we have the estimates from the purebreds, but where we accounted for the breed origin of alleles for the crossbred animals. So here, crossbred animals are not a part of the data, but they are predicted based on the separate estimates of SNP effects for each breed. Or we just combined all the data we had, either the purebreds data or the purebreds plus the crossbreds or admixed individuals data. So this assumes actually identical SNP effects for all the breeds that we have. And we also applied our breed origin model with 2 different assumptions. In one, we assume that the effects of these SNP effects, these SNP effects are uncorrelated. So practically, we assume that the genetic correlations between the breeds are 0. Or we also assumed that these effects are correlated. And here you can see that we use the data of crossbred animals as well. So we are not just predicting the crossbred animals, but crossbred animals are also a part of the data. So we first checked if, assuming that the correlation or the variances and covariances are not equally distributed across the genome, we first checked if we could improve accuracies by assuming heterogeneous correlations across the genome for different breeds. The idea behind is that first, in a genome region, you may not have a SNP that is in high LD with the QTL, but collectively, the SNPs around the QTL can explain a very high proportion of the QTL. And also, between the different breeds, there may be some regions where the LD is more persistent compared to the others. So you can use, or you can exploit that information region-wise. And so these are all different breeds, but if you just look at, for instance, here, you can see that when we assumed a single correlation, that's the genome-wide correlation, that's mainly what is being used in practice if it's applied. It's much less than assuming heterogeneous correlation structure, over the genome. So here I have 4 plots for a Holstein red, Jersey, and admixed animals here. So the first 3, that is the green ones, they show when we use the SNP effects from the pure breeds to predict the others. So Holstein, this is within breed prediction. So you use Holstein SNP effects to predict the breeding values of Holstein candidates. And here you use reds and Jersey. So we can see that actually a crossbreed prediction doesn't really work well, and which, this has been actually shown in many studies that the crossbreed prediction is not really useful unless the breeds are very related. And then we just combined all data from the pure breeds, but it didn't really help, or even sometimes decreased, especially for the smallest breed, which you may expect, because then the whole data set sort of dominated by the breeds, the large breeds, because we have simulated Jersey to be a small breed, to represent a small breed in our reference population. But when we added the data from admixed animals, just as it is a different breed, we sort of recovered the loss in prediction accuracy when we use just the purebred animals. But when we accounted for the breed origin of alleles, then we also further improved the accuracies for all the breeds, and also for the admixed animals. You can see that it's from 0.83 to 0.88. With or without assuming correlations or no correlations between the breeds. There is not really much difference that we observed for correlated or uncorrelated SNP effects when using the breed origin models for this data set specifically, which we could expect, because actually we have breeds that are pretty much different that we have started initially. At least they are distinct breeds, that they don't have so much similar pattern, LD pattern over their genome. So if I just summarize that when we combined the pure breeds and admixed populations data, we had an increase in prediction accuracy for the small breed and also for the admixed breed. For the admixed breed, it may not be surprising, because when you just combine all the data, then you can think admixed breed itself can be a separate breed with its own LD structure, and without including that breed in the reference population, you cannot reach a very high accuracy. So when you just add the admixed breed data to the pool of the pure breeds data, you actually add information from, say, a different breed. But when we consider the breed origin of allele approach, then we actually increase the highest accuracies. Of course, that dependent on the correlation scenario between the breeds. Here I had a correlation scenario of 0.5. So if you have a much higher correlation, then the advantage of the breed origin of allele methods will be lower. So the whole story, or more simulations or more scenarios you can find here. So I know you don't like maybe simulations, but we have some experience with real data. Maybe not the best example we could find, but with the simulations, we have well-defined breeds, and we assume that we know the breed origin of the alleles. But in practice, that's not the case. So first, you have to find what are the breeds in your data, what kind of breeds you have in your population, and then based on that information, you have to find the purebred animals. And with these purebred animals, then you have to find the breed origin of allele for each crossbred animal. Anna did study this on red dairy cattle, where she had about 50,000 animals. So she followed a step, like she first imputed and phased the genotypes, and then used that mixture to find purebred animals, and then she estimated the breed origin of alleles using ChromoPainter. Mogens mentioned earlier in the previous session that also as part of Gentoo, Didier and his group developed a software which could also be used for estimation of breed origin of alleles. So first we had a problem when we tried to find some purebred animals. So these are the bulls that are registered in the pedigree as Danish Red. So in total we had about 5,000 bulls, and 1,000 of them were registered as Danish Red. But when we ran the admixture analysis to find these purebred animals, we only ended up with like 250 animals. And for Swedish Red, we actually had less than 70. Even though we used a maybe relatively low threshold for these animals. And we included Holstein because when we looked at the pedigree of this population, of the RDC population, we saw some traces of the Holstein animals. Also the brown civis, but we didn't have any data from brown civis, so we couldn't include them in here. It was really minor, but yeah. So this low number of purebred animals, which we use to sort of paint the chromosome of the crossbred animals, we didn't really reach high accuracies when assigning breed origin of the alleles. So you can see that only 40% of the alleles could be assigned with an accuracy of, or with a probability of 0.90, and the rest was very low. So this was also a limitation when we were running the analysis. Just please keep that in mind. So here are the results that we had, or one of the earlier results that Anna had. So the blue one is the analysis where we just combine all available data, like a joint analysis, assuming identical SNP effects for the breeds. The green one is when we use breed origin model with assuming correlated SNP effects. And the yellow one is the model where we just ignore the correlations and we assume still breed-specific SNP effects, but no correlation. So breeds do not use information from each other. So we didn't see, as you can see from here, an advantage of applying breed origin of allele model anywhere. But one good thing is that when we assumed the SNP effects are correlated, we could actually reach the same accuracy as the joint model, or as just simply combining all the data we have. Maybe it's not very surprising for those people who knows RDC, because I mean there has been an exchange of genetic material for maybe more than 2 decades between them, and they run a joint evaluation since around 2002 to be exact, I think. So they become more and more similar in time. So this is not really a good example of, or it's still a good example though, because we can still get the same accuracy. So the model works, but maybe it's not the best case scenario that we should try the model. So we tested, that could be due that we didn't have, so that could be due that the breeds that form the RDC population are actually really similar. Or It could be due to the assignment of the breed origin of alleles. Due to that, we have very few purebred animals. So we did some simulations to test this, and we started with a correlation of 0.25 between the breeds. So here is the joint model where you just combine all the information. Here is the breed origin model. So when the breeds are distinct, then you can see that there is an advantage of using breed origin of allele model. But as you introduce error to the estimation of breed origin models, so basically here we switched 5% of the alleles to be wrong. And here we switched 30% of the alleles to be wrong. Not exactly. Basically what we did was that we divided the genome into SNPs of 10. And then from there, we selected 30% of these genome regions. And then from there, we decided which alleles to be switched. So we either switched the Jersey alleles to be Holstein or Holstein alleles to be Jersey. So practically, you expect that half of them are already Jersey or Holstein. So in practice, what we did was actually switching like 2.5% and 15%. But the thing that you need to take from this figure is actually that even if you start with a very low correlation between the breeds, if the breed origin of assignments are wrong, then you can have very high correlation, or you can end up very high correlation between the breeds. So you always have the joint model competitive to the breed origin model. So that could be one reason that we didn't really see an advantage of breed origin model in the RDC case. But Anna was working on a breed origin model. That's a single step version of the breed origin model, which she has been running some tests on the Irish data, a very large scale data. And the first results she got was promising. So there we could observe the advantage of breed origin models because actually the breeds were pretty distinct. So I think it's due that, you know, we could easily discriminate perhaps the breed origin of alleles, maybe in a better way. And you will see maybe more from Anna on this single step breed origin of allele model tomorrow in the Young Scientist session. Also, we worked with Yuli on the use of summary statistics rather than the data from purebreds, because it might be the case that you may not really have access to the purebred data or all the purebred data that you have in your gene pool of the crossbred animals. And there's, you know, the privacy reasons and so on. So people may not like to, or they may not share the data, actual data, but they can still share the summary statistics. So we tested if it would work with summary statistics when you just use your crossbred data, but the summary statistics from the purebreds. We did it in a Bayesian way, so we just used it as priors or as a supplement to the data of crossbred animals, but Yuli will give more details tomorrow. So that should be all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Emrah. Question from Didier.
In your RDC study, a real study, another explanation maybe is that you have already accumulated a number of crossbreeding generation, and so the effect estimated in purebred are eroded more or less because the very long distance LD disappears, and as soon as you progress in terms of number of generations, this the SNP effects changed. Did you account for that?
Not really. Not really. We didn't So we didn't really. First, we didn't try to look at just the purebreds because we didn't have the purebred data. So we had like 50,000 individuals data, but only like thousands of animals from each of the pure breeds. So I agree that the effects of the QTL may have changed because also the background changes when you cross these animals. So it's not the same effect in the pure breeds and also in the crossbreds. So I agree that also the structure of the LD changes and the effects are changing. That's right, but we didn't do anything specific. So we just assume that it's the same in the pure breeds, it's the same in the crossbreds, no matter what generation it is from.
I was wondering why the difference between the model with correlation and without correlation was so small. Did you use in the correlation model the true parameter, or did you estimate the correlation between the breeds, or what was your approach?
Thanks. Yes, we used the true parameter. So actually we had estimated at the QTL level. So that's the true genetic correlation. And we translated it into a correlation of SNP effects using an equation, a normal regular equation. So we knew it, but there was a difference. There was a difference, not for the simulation, because in the simulation we had already, distinct breeds there. So I think the LD structure was really different in those breeds. So there was not really a correlation, or the correlation was really weak there. But there was a huge difference, I think, in Anna's study here in the RDC. So you can see this is uncorrelated one, this is the correlated one. But we actually estimate. So this is a fully Bayesian version. So we estimate all the parameters. We also estimate the correlations or covariances and variances. But you can see there's a difference here, and much bigger than what I showed for my simulations. Yeah.
It's back to this RDC problem. There you had a reference population. You had 700, 800 Holstein bulls and only 60, 70 SRB bulls. Won't there be a tendency that those effects from SRB, they'll be regressed towards the mean because you have not that much information? So if you did some simulations, then you would select more for the Holstein genes, having these Holsteins into the simulations, and since they're also more recent, so it's a decision, because doing that, then the breed will not be that valuable for crossbreeding, because they'll tend to be more alike with the real Holstein. So what about maybe using the NIF reference populations? Then you would draw them in the Nordic direction instead of drawing them in the Holstein direction. Maybe I have failed, but this is just my thought.
Yeah, I definitely agree. When you have that small, so we started with very small number of, we started with very small number of Swedish reference populations, but it also matters how much they are represented in the crossbred animals. Because if you have many crosses of these animals, you actually have maybe pretty good reference population for Swedish animals as well. So having less Swedish purebred animals as purebred bulls to paint the chromosomes does not exactly mean that we had less information from Swedish animals. So I don't really know the figures here, but maybe we had like among the 40,000 cows, maybe we had like 10,000 animals with information from the Swedish, genome segments and such. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Imran. So I think at least in conclusion, what is very nice is we have a method that really improves, especially for these crossbreds. Some scenarios is more difficult, but even then we don't really lose information. And so I think it's relatively positive. Now we go to sort of a more sort of the genetic traits of efficiency, and Rasmus will take us through this genetic component of dynamic residual feed intake.
Yeah, thank you, Mogens. I think it's working. So yeah, we changed subject here. So well, my working title is a genetic component of a dynamic RFI model. And I would like to thank the group here that has helped me on both data, but also very good ideas for how to work with this trait. Let's see. But the aim of this presentation is to give you an overview of which data do we have and how to include feed intake data into a feed efficiency or genomic feed efficiency evaluation. And just an outline. So first of all, maybe take a step back and look at what is good feed efficiency. What is residual feed intake? I just mentioned it, but not described it. What data do we have and how do we treat it? And then end up with some conclusions. So, but let's start with the feed intake trait itself. What is good feed intake? I think, is it good to have a high or low feed intake? Well, it depends. And also if you ask 10 farmers, you'll most likely get 10 different answers, depending on which production system do we have. Is it grazing? Is it indoor feeding? Or if it's indoor feeding, is it which soil do he has? Is it favorable to grow maize or grass? You could also see it a different way. We also had a car example from Morten. I did a little different. So you could also go from A to B in a Volkswagen Up or even in the Audi sports van here. And from an economic point of view, I'll prefer the Up. That's also the one I'm driving in. And yes, I fit in an Up. So yeah. So let's come back to feed efficiency. It's basically, if you look at the notation, it's improving the balance between the input and the output. So in this case, it's you could say input is the feed, and the output is milk and also, of course, some meat. And commonly in breeding goals for pigs and broilers, we see that we have this trait in there. So that's as feed conversion ratio. That's what they use. And what it does is it minimizes the feed intake and improves the yield. So, but is that favorable? Because we are working with a slightly different animal, or much more different animal, the dairy cow that has the lactation. However, if you say feed conversion ratio, it's easy to understand and interpret for the farmers. You can say it's one number and shows how efficient the animal is. So it's easy. However, it has some trade-off in dairy cattle if you look into mobilization. So you'll see an increased mobilization in early lactation if you just breed highly on FCR. And especially this early lactation dilemma is a significant difference, as I just mentioned, between growing animals and lactating animals. So I think it's quite important that we have, to recognize this difference. And of course, it also stands for sows in pig production. So if we go more into breeding goals, FCR is not a preferable trait to put in that because we have some issues with, for example, double counting. So in breeding goal setting, we prefer that traits are uncorrelated, so we don't have to deal with this double counting. And since feed conversion ratio, well, it's feed intake over a yield or vice versa, well, that means it will have some quite high correlation to the other traits in the TMI. Then there was another proposal from Jenny Price in 2015, the index called Feed Save, and it's widely used actually in the industry. Jan also mentioned it earlier. In the Nordic countries, we switched it around, so it's Save Feed. And you could say the residual feed intake part here is actually uncorrelated to production and the size of the cow. So that's very convenient. But what is residual feed intake, and does it work as a trait for selection? If we look at residual feed intake, well, basically it's the difference between the observed feed intake and the predicted. And the predicted we can calculate from this least square equation we have here. So you have the observed DMI, and then you have this regression analysis where you have a regression on milk energy and milk towards maintenance. That's the body weight powered by 0.75. So it's a body weight. And then the change in body energy. And then finally, you have your residual, which is the one you use for genetic evaluation. It could also be seen as a two-step procedure in this case. It's developed for growing animals back in the 60s, so it's some years ago. So it needs adjustments for mobilization and deposition. You also see there's change in body energy. And mobilization and deposition is important for later priorities, and in first priority, the growth part is quite important. Negative values here are favorable because then you perform better than you expect. And it's phenotypically independent of the energy sinks, which is quite nice, but it's not genetically, which is the one we are after in breeding goal setting. So if we look also back in history, Kennedy et al. In 1993 proposed a model called genetic RFI that was genetically independent of the energy sinks. Then you could say, why do we not see that it's widely used? Well, this method really requires a huge amounts of high quality feed intake data, and we do not have that. It seems like collaboration is, you could say, increasing it now, but still it's not like, you could say, test day yield. We have millions of records, but that's not the case for feed intake. Here's a slide about the regressions. I just mentioned them in the regression analysis. In the past years, some people has been going more into this topic, because that's where we see a relation between nutrient theory and nutrition theory and genetic, and also because we've seen there's not been you could say that the level of the regressions has been shown to be quite low compared to what you should expect from nutrition theory. But if we look at a paper from 1995 by Verkamp on limited data, it was the Langhill data, as I remember, it was 250 cows from Langhill. There were small differences between the phenotypic RFI regressions and nutrition theory. But if we look at the genetic regressions, there was some difference to the nutrition theory, and it was especially on the maintenance part. We saw that. But what should we expect? I put in here, I think it's very important to state that we should not compare apples and bananas, and what do we mean by that? If we look at the models people have published, well, there might be some confounding in the models, in these RFI models, because not all the traits are present. For example, body condition scoring is quite important in nutrition theory to account for the mobilization or deposition. But in a lot of these RFI studies, they are not accounted for. So that's very important when we look into what should we expect. But also put it in as an open question. So if you have comments, questions, or please feel free to give them here. Also you can speak later on. What do you think it should be, or it could be? And I've tried to just put some examples in here from the Nordic feeding tables, NORFA. And if we look at the energy corrected milk, well, I think it's quite common that we say that the energy density of a kilogram of energy corrected milk is 3.14 megajoule, and then divided by energy density of the feed. That is the average in Denmark, and you can see here it's shown in net energy. Then we expect it takes 0.48 kilograms of dry matter to produce 1 kilogram of ECM. And if we look at body weight, I have transformed the metabolic body weight value to body weight. So here it's 0.21 divided by the energy density of the feed. So it means it takes 0.03 kilograms of dry matter to maintain 1 kilo of body weight. And then I'm working on the delta body weight and BCS. That's something I like to look more into to see what should we expect from this. Yeah. Okay, then a little bit more back to the work on the prediction. My first part of my PhD project is to extend the model by Martin et al. From 2021. Didier showed some figures from that study. That was a dynamic RFI model using time series data, phenotypic time series data. And well, my project will work on extending this by adding a genetic component. And here collaboration is very important. I just mentioned data is very important. So we have a higher number of records, but also new ideas is also very important. So we develop it as good as possible. And the plan is to present the results at the World Congress next year. So, but back to which data do we have then? I'll try to give you a brief overview here. So within the Gentor project, we have the Danish data, that's number one, from the Forum data. Then there's access to French data from Gabi and Pegase. And then we have also access to the Dutch data from Wageningen University. And then we have also made an agreement outside of the Gentor project with the RDGP consortium. And RDGP stands for Resilient Dairy Genome Project, which is led, as I understand, by Guelph University in Canada. So there we have access to, so the Canadian data, that's for, sorry, it's these two slides. But you see here, we have from Guelph here and Alberta, there's some data there. We are also talking to the Americans to see if they will also like to join the project. Then we have also an yes from Spain and Switzerland. So I think that's quite nice that, and I expect that to be with these countries that has accepted, it's around 4,000 to 5,000 cows. So that's my expectation. And how do we treat this data? This is just a brief overview of the editing procedure. So first of all, we said extreme values missing. So a milk production per day of 200 kilograms of milk doesn't make any sense. So there's that missing. Then we do some outlier detection, looking at the mean plus minus 3 times the standard deviation. Set out of that range, we set it missing. Then we also have a quite high requirement on the lactation length on 200 days in milk to make sure we don't do too much extrapolation. Then also nonsensical records is set missing. That means if from week to week, if the data changes too much, then we set it missing. But if, for example, dry matter intake and ECM drops suddenly down, then we do not, because that could be a case of mastitis, for example. So we try to not remove the biological records that changes a lot, but the errors. And then we also do require cohesive lactations. And now I'll try to show a little bit more about what data do we have right now. I have access to, so that is the Forum and the French data. So in Forum we have a little less than 800 cows, and then a little more than 300 cows from the 2 French herds. And as you can see, the distribution of the data through lactation. So the blue line represents first parity, red line second, and third parity is represented by green. And it looks quite nice. We have data all through lactation, and then suddenly we have a drop in lactation, which is caused by either culling or drying off. And if we look even more on the data, here is a box plot through lactation for dry matter intake on the 3 herds. So you have the 3 herds showed in top, and then the numbers represent the parities. And if we start to look at the first parity data, we see a rapid increase in dry matter intake in early lactation, then it reaches a maximum, and then a quite stable slope, which is kind of expected for the first parity animals. And we see that in all 3 herds, so it's quite nice. If we look at second and third parity, again, a rapid increase in dry matter, we reach a maximum intake, and then there's a slightly decreasing dry matter intake through lactation. Little bit the same story for energy corrected milk. The first parity cows increase in early lactation, have a maximum yield, and then we have a slightly decreasing, or we have a slightly decreasing slope, which is expected for first parity animals. And then if you compare to the later parities, we have a higher production level as expected because they are more, you could say, grown, and then a more decreasing slope after peak yield. So it looks as expected and quite nice. And finally, the body weight. We see a decrease in first parity due to mobilization in the body weight. And then we have a growth period during first parity in all 3 herds. And then a higher level on body weight for second and third parity in all 3 herds. And then, of course, mobilization period in early lactation. Then we have the deposition period. So I think this looks quite nice for further analysis. Yeah, and my final slide with some conclusions. So we have data from collaboration among many research partners, and both in Gentor, but also outside of Gentor. So I think that's quite nice. And we will work on extending this dynamic RFI model from work package 2 to include a genetic component. And the preliminary results will be presented tomorrow at the Young Scientist session. So I hope I'll see most of you there. So yeah, tomorrow. So that was it for me.
Thank you very much, Rasmus. A question or an answer to that question.
Yeah.
What to put in the model?
I don't know.
How did you record the body weight? How did you record the body weight? The body weight, is it automated recording?
Oh, yeah. So the question is about, is the body weight recorded automatically? Yes, I know for the Fulham herd, it was done in the AMS. I'm not sure about the French data, but so we have weekly averages for most of the traits. They are normally all present at the same time. I think, Morten, it was you. Oh, sorry. Was it? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just a question. Are you treating each lactation as an individual record or as part of the data set, or are you looking at correlations between lactations on individual animals? And I say that because certainly in Holsteins, when you get really increased body weight at the end of one lactation, it can have a really bad effect on the next lactation.
Good question. We treat them as you could say, so inject-corrected milk in first and second parity is treated as two different traits, so we can establish a correlation structure between them. So we don't try to, like I think many studies has tried to incorporate a parity effect, but we decided to not do that and treat it, you could say, kind of more what you normally do in evaluations. Yeah.
It's about the correction for the metabolic body weight. From a biological point of view, it makes a lot of sense to do this, but one could discuss whether to include it from an economic point of view, because it's just you are correcting the heavy animals are sort of it has a better residual feed intake. The heavier the animals is, the better residual feed intake. So, and from an economic point of view, it's just waste of energy with a big body. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that was for me. No. So yeah, what actually we try, I think this comes back to the whole feed safe definition, the question to body weight, because if you take residual feed intake, it's, well, in its definition, it should be uncorrelated to body weight. So we can compare a cow producing 40 kilograms of milk, either it's weighing 600 kilos or 700 kilograms. But in the feed safe definition, you have RFI, but you also have the maintenance part, and which corresponds to around 30% in theory, I think, of the economic impact. So there you breed for smaller cows, but you of course also needs to adjust for the meat production, which you also referred to earlier, Morten, that it has some cost to be big, but then for the cows, but of course there will also be a higher meat production. So there's some, you have to consider something, I think, from the yeah, Nick?
It's more a comment. If you have animals of the same size with different maintenance, then I think you need to be careful about getting rid of maintenance, because it has other functions than just waste. It supports a whole load of other resilience functions. So
But this you have to calculate in the other breed values.
I think that, yeah, I think there's a comment from Morten.
Yeah. It's good to have a discussion to finalize over the beer tonight. Yeah. So thank you very much, Rasmus.
So we switch to genomics of resilience, and Roberta will take us through that, please.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm Roberta Rostellato from Israel, and I'm going to present you the study about the genomic evaluation of functional longevity, which is used as a measure of resilience. It is the interplay between the task 2.2 and 4.4. The aim of the task 2.2 was to investigate the influence of production, reproduction, type, and health traits on longevity in order to propose this trait as an indicator of long-term resilience. We know that resilient animals are able to maintain their normal productive life when confronted with environmental perturbations. So, for example, they are able to continue to grow and to reproduce successfully, reducing the risk to be killed. So longevity reflects the accumulated benefits of good resilience. And after adjustment for factors other than the innate animal resilience, for example, for the farm management, we can use longevity as a proxy for resilience. In the study, we investigated two longevity traits, the true and the functional longevity. The true longevity is the ability to avoid any culling, whereas the functional longevity is the ability to avoid culling for reasons other than low milk production, for example, for fertility problems or diseases. Survival analysis, was the methodology we used for the study, revealed that in French Holstein cows, the insemination status, the calving ease, the type traits, mainly the udder depth, the clinical mastitis, the somatic cell count, and the displaced abomasum have a measured effect on longevity, and they can be used as a predictors for true and functional longevity. In addition, we found that functional longevity is affected by diseases and reproductive problems that are factors that are known to reflect resilience. The aim of the task 4.4 is to develop a genomic evaluation for resilience. So given that we can use functional longevity as a proxy for resilience, we are going to develop a genomic prediction for these traits. But how can we do that? In French dairy cattle, functional longevity is analyzed using survival analysis. This methodology allows to study data from both dead cows and the animals still alive at the end of the investigated period. In addition, in the model, we can include also the effects that vary with time, for example, the milk production and the herd size. But although this methodology is a good tool to study life data, it is not accurate enough for genetic evaluation of functional longevity. In fact, the EBVs of young sires have a poor reliability, and it potentially generates a large variation during their first years. And it is because a large proportion of daughters are still alive. And unfortunately, this variation is not appreciated by breeding companies and farmers. And in addition, also EBVs for cows have poor reliability. But we know that functional longevity is genetically correlated with a number of functional traits. For example, it has a strong positive correlation with the conception rate and a negative genetic correlation with clinical mastitis. So a combined polygenic evaluation has been proposed with the aim to combine functional longevity and other correlated functional traits that are fertility traits, other health traits, and type traits. But how can we study all the traits together? In fact, a multi-trait model is not, with all the traits, is not routinely feasible because we have too much data and the traits are described by very different models. So in 2001, Ducrot proposed a two-steps approach to mimic the desiderable multi-trait model. So in the step 1, a univariate evaluation using an accurate model for each trait is performed to obtain a corrected phenotype and an associated weight for each cause and each trait. So they are used in step 2, where a multi-trait evaluation with a very simple model that is the same for all traits, whatever the complexity of the model we used in step 1, is performed. So corrected phenotypes and associated weights are obtained using a univariate model or a multi-trait model for the traits described by linear models. And as I said before, functional longevity is analyzed using a survival model. This model is not a linear model. Residuals are not normally distributed. A part of the data is censored, and there are the time-dependent effects in the model. So we cannot calculate corrected phenotypes and the associated weights as for the other traits, but they are calculated using an equation that was developed with this objective. When incorporated into a univariate BLAP animal model, they should lead to the same EBVs of bulls as the ones obtained with the survival model. So for the step 2, a multi-trait evaluation with a simple model is performed. And in the end, we have new breeding values for all animals and all traits, which combine the direct performances and the indirect performances from correlated traits. The combined polygenic evaluation has several advantages. First of all, we can combine the results of survival analysis used for functional longevity with the various predictors of these traits, which are analyzed using different models. All animals, cows and bulls, get an EBV for all traits that can be used directly to calculate the total merit index. We can correct for biases due to selection on correlated traits, and genetic trends are more correct. And the reliabilities are higher. For functional longevity, we can see from this table that the reliability of EBVs for young bulls increased after the inclusion of functional traits and the type traits. So EBVs for these animals don't change as much as before, and they are more accepted by the breeding companies and the farmers. But the benefit is also for the other traits. For example, the reliabilities for the clinical mastitis are higher when we include also the somatic cell score and the functional longevity. To move to the task 4.4, today the single-step evaluation is more and more considered as the standard for the genomic evaluation, and it allows to correct biases for the genomic preselection. However, a survival analysis software allowing the inclusion of genomic information doesn't exist. A univariate single-step evaluation using the corrected phenotypes and the associated weights doesn't work for functional longevity. In fact, the genetic trend is unrealistic for young bulls. And there is no software for a multi-trait single-step evaluation when we want to include traits described by very different models. So we want in this task to develop a combined single-step evaluation using the two-step approach. So the aim is to test the feasibility and the benefits of a combined single-step evaluation, including functional longevity and the correlated traits. We want to show that it is realistic to conceive a routine genomic evaluation that is accurate enough to generate genetic progress on resilience. So this scheme summarizes the different steps. Firstly, we are performing a univariate single-step evaluation using an accurate model for each trait to obtain the corrected phenotypes and the associated weights. Before to move to step 2, we want to re-estimate the genetic correlations between traits, including the genomic information. So after that, a multi-trait single-step evaluation using the simple model will be performed. And we will compare the combined polygenic and the combined single-step evaluations. The study is carried out in Montbéliard breed. Data are from cows born from 2000 and 2019, and we selected the sires with at least 30 daughters. And the male reference population included almost 2,500 bulls that are genotyped using the 50K chip. To develop the method, we are going to analyze 6 traits that are the functional longevity, the conception rate in primiparous and multiparous cows, the somatic cell score, the clinical mastatis, and the other depth. The additional traits will be added after the validation of the methodology. So at present, we are working on step 1 and we are estimating the genetic correlation. So I invite you to attend the next Gentor meeting for the results. And to conclude, I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Roberta. Questions, please.
Sorry, it can be a very specific question, but what are the effects that are not the same between the different traits that prevents you to run a multi-trait model? What sort of effects are different so that you cannot really run a multi-trait single-step model? Yeah.
Because in a multi-trait single-step model, we have traits that are described by different models. For example, we have linear models with different fixed effects. In some cases, the residual variance is homogeneous. In other cases, is heterogeneous. So it is almost impossible to combine everything in the same multi-trait. And then there is the problem of the functional longevity, that in this case, it is the main trait that it is evaluated with a completely different model with respect to the others.
Okay. Last question.
It's a more general question. I was thinking, if we use sex-sorted semen and manage to reduce the number of recruitment heifers so that there is no surplus of heifers, I guess longevity or the and voluntary culling will become more and more important, right? Because there is no reserve extra animals to choose among. So longevity will be a more important trait in the future.
Yeah. If, as I said, after correction for farmers' management and other factors that are longevity, so the ability to survive, to grow, to reproduce is very, very important.
Yeah, one last question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask. I obviously all your work is done with data that you have and can get hold of. What would you like data on cows to make a better multi-trait analysis? And could Gentor put a message out to the industry that we want information on these specific health traits on cows to make better analysis in the future?
Yeah, to have more data about health traits, especially diseases, can be very useful to improve everything I explained. So for the moment, we are including also traits that are routinely included in genetic evaluation, in this case in Montbéliard breed, but then it will be applied also to other breeds. Well, we have the clinical mastitis and the somatic cell score that are already included. Honestly, I don't know the correlation. We didn't estimate yet with other traits, health traits.
So last we have hopefully done online. Let's see if the level is good this time. Hold your ears.
Testing 1, 2. Are we good?
Perfect.
Yeah, good. And you can see my slides?
Yes. Yes.
Excellent. So I start away. Sorry again that I couldn't be there, and I believe it's 6 o'clock your time, so you're probably all getting hungry. So I don't like to talk fast, but I think I will talk fast. I'm not sure I can't remember what Mogens asked me to talk about. I think it was something to do with what we would need from a genomic information perspective to help us enable the deployment or delivery of more accurate decision support tools. So when we talk about decision support tools specifically for breeding, there are many of them. We probably actually don't see breeding indexes or breeding objectives as decision support tools, but they really are, because they condense a huge amount of information into one single value, which is used to rank animals. So it's probably one of the biggest, most used decision support tools in ruminants anyway. Sire advice is other ones. Morten mentioned about these production indexes or culling indexes, where you bring together the additive effects and the non-additive effects. So now you can probably see where I'm going with this talk. Also, in the very first session, I talked about these animal value indexes, where you try to ascribe a value on an animal. So again, those of you that are in the area of animal breeding, you're thinking, okay, for breeding, you're trying to predict the future, but because of Mendelian sampling, because of when sperm is being produced or eggs are being produced, you don't know what half of the genome went into that egg. You cannot predict with much certainty what the genome of the future individual is. But if the individual is standing right in front of you, then you know its genome, and you know how the genes and the mutations within those genes, well, you don't know them, but you would like to know how they interact with each other. So again, you're probably seeing where I'm going here is that decision support, the breeding decision support tools traditionally relied on additive effects, but the downstream decision support tools are probably relying also on non-additive effects. And there is little evidence that exists to suggest that the broad sense heritability, especially for traits like fertility, tends to be double that of the narrow sense. So in other words, the inclusion of non-additive effects, or the importance of non-additive effects, tends to be just as important as additive effects, especially for traits like fertility and viability. And Morten talked about that earlier. Traits that you see a benefit of heterosis. Heterosis is really just non-additive effects. Very, very busy slide. I presented this at the EAP, whatever, 1 or 2 or 3 years ago. And this is largely what Work Package 5 worked on. So you have the pre-breeding decision support, which is, well, I'm going to just rank my females, be they dairy or beef or sheep, doesn't make a difference. Rank them on this breeding index. The genetically elite animals, I will then use a dairy or a beef breed to generate more replacements. If it's genetically inferior, then I will use the terminal sire matings that Morten talked about. However, and this would be especially true in Ireland, where we have a seasonal calving and seasonal breeding period. So what are we now? We're in November now. So cows are starting to be dried off. So farmers are now making a decision as what cows are they going to keep over the winter and calve next year, or what cows are they going to cull. So the cow index that we developed is actively being used at this time of the year. It'll also be used at the start of the breeding season. So this is where cows, we don't expect them to live for too much longer. So therefore, what's the point in keeping them if they're going to die in the next few months, or if they're really not going to live all that much longer? So that brings us on to the breeding period then. And I'm not going to talk about it here, but the prediction of likelihood of conception. So if the cow has a high likelihood of conception, this was task 5.3, I think. If the cow has a high likelihood of success of conception, you may use sex semen. And then with that is the whole issue of sire advice. And I talked about this at the very first session as well. Chris's work, which I'll talk about in a second, that was dealing on dairy matings. But I think as I mentioned earlier, what's really interesting is the beef and dairy matings and the risk associated with that, because we know on average, most beef bulls have a greater calving difficulty than dairy bulls. And actually, if you look at the variance that exists within those breeds, it tends to be quite large for some of the beef breeds. And then once the calf is born, well, you may genotype the animal, and once the calf is born, then you need to decide, am I going to keep that calf, or am I going to rear that calf for beef for slaughter? So if we just go through those individually, so there's breeding goals for beef and there's breeding goals for dairy. I know most people probably in the audience are dairy, and I think it was Morten mentioned it as well, is the whole beef on dairy, which is really increasing in popularity. So what's genomics going to do? Well, it's really going to drive genetic gain, and many people will be familiar with this. It's called the Breeder's equation, or Rendell and Robertson's equation. Genetic gain per year is a function of the intensity of selection, the accuracy of selection, the genetic variability, and the generation interval. So genomics will give us more accurate genetic evaluations. It gives us better parentage. Talk on earlier about breed composition. Even if we were to just, like in Ireland, we include breed composition as covariates. They're predicted based on parentage. But of course, if one of the parents is crossbred, in the absence of DNA information, you cannot predict, or you cannot know what the breed composition of that calf is. So in other words, if you have a Jersey Holstein sire mated to a Jersey Holstein cow, you could end up theoretically with a purebred Holstein or a purebred Jersey. We assume it's 50-50, which is probability terms more accurate. Also, and Mogens put it up, and then Morten put it up, was we don't have this, but where we would love to go is in a crossbreed genomic evaluation, where we can compare all the breeds against each other. And this is crucially important for people who are going to embark on a crossbreeding program. More traits, because if we don't need to phenotype as many animals on a routine basis and can rely on a strong reference population, we could also then identify the traits or the animals who are what I call curve benders. So where the association is due to linkage, where genes are co-located, as opposed to pleiotropy, where you tend not to be able to break. Inbreeding is important, and just on the issue of composites, Martin mentioned that they don't use crossbred bulls. I actually see the future of beef on dairy being actually crossbred bulls, which is complementarity between, for example, the Limousin, which is good muscularity, but long gestation, with the Angus, where you cannot put muscle on the Angus. You cannot really get muscular Angus bulls, but they are easy calving and short gestation. So I think a composite between those two type of breeds could actually be hugely useful, as well as benefiting from the heterosis of the male animal itself for natural mating, the libido and semen quality, etc. And of course, you can do all this earlier. The SAR mating, so this is Chris, she was working on this with some great work. Again, she focused on the dairy by dairy matings. We can easily apply this to beef by beef, or from my perspective, I think what's really cool is the beef by dairy matings. And I mentioned this earlier about, rather than focusing on the mean, maybe we should also be focusing on the variability. So providing a new type of breeding value, which is the risk assessment. And essentially one could use the analogy of the stocks, whereby you could put your money on or invest in banks, which tend to have a high mean. Traditionally, we thought they were low risk, but now they might actually be high risk, and balance that across your share portfolio. So that would be the same as a bull team, where you're trying to mix mean and variability. I think this is really useful for beef on dairy. There is a little bit of reluctance by some dairy farmers to use beef, and by having a terrible bull who just has 5% of its calvings are cesarean. So on average, it's easy. The bull is easy calving, but 5% of his calvings result in cesareans. That'll destroy that farmer's confidence in the use of beef. So of course, when it comes to SAR advice, we have the additive effects, but also there's the non-additive, and we do see a lot of this already in dairy matings, like the lethal haplotypes, the HH1, HH2, etc., the Holstein haplotypes. We can include imprinted effects if we were to know them. Also the issue of parentage and locus specific inbreeding. So this mating could result in a high global inbreeding, but it may be in intergenic regions that don't really cause any effect. And of course, we know that inbreeding in tandem with selection can actually be good, where it's slow and you're purging out the unfavorable effects of inbreeding. Because what you're trying to do with selection is actually increase the allele frequencies in the favorable genes or the favorable mutations. And that's what inbreeding time does. It increases the frequency of the favorable alleles towards homozygosity. So it can be good if it's correctly targeted. Then we move on to the production indexes. Mogens work package 4, every animal or every trait, most traits follow this normal distribution, right? And on the right-hand side, let's just pretend this is milk yield or its growth rate. So you like all the animals on the right-hand side. So assuming the trait is heritable, decently heritable, you would breed from those animals, taking cognizance of relatedness, etc. And you try to shift that distribution to the right. But of course, you can also shift the distribution to the right by deleting all the animals to the left. That'll also increase your mean. So by breeding the animals in tandem with culling the worst animals, you can make that distribution go faster. And that has led us to the development of what we called the cow index, the cow's own worth, where you look at the actual predicted remaining lifetime performance of the animal, which we know, of course, is a function of its additive genetic merit, but also its non-additive genetic merit, as well as other contributing factors. And our non-additive genetic merit heretofore was based on a really rough heterosis coefficient. And some of our work here at the moment in beef is showing the relationship between the heterosis coefficient and actual heterozygosity isn't necessarily all that strong. And of course, it will differ depending on the differences between or divergence between the breeds. So we have that index rolling for the past few years in dairy. It's partially built in beef, but the person in charge has gone off on maternity leave, should be back soon. So hopefully we'll have that beef culling index developed or deployed in the national database pretty soon. And now the sheep guys in Ireland want one developed as well for sheep. So what's the use of genomics here? Well, if we can predict longevity using genomic information, that would be absolutely brilliant, because longevity is a key driver of this index. Morten talked about these production values. Yes, looked at the additive genetic effect, and we have those. Can we get them more accurate? I'm sure Mogens can. The expected global heterosis is what we currently use, but we would have the actual heterosis, where we're looking at the actual heterozygosity, but doing it in a locus-specific approach. And also, theoretically, of course, we can have epistasis. Then we have the permanent environmental effects. Now, I would argue that there's could be a little bit of epigenetics inside here. Could we have alleles that predispose certain regions of the genome to epigenetic effects? Potentially. If we look at milk production, for example, it's around 35% heritable, with around 52% repeatable. So there's around 27% or 17% permanent environmental effect there, some of which could be maybe picked up with advanced genomic approaches. The last one then, I think, was the sale index, whereby, remember the first session I talked about, you have a calf and you want to know, will I keep that calf to become a cow, either in a dairy or beef herd, or will it be such a useless cow that I'm just better off rearing that animal for beef or selling that animal for beef? If we had developed this around 3 months earlier, it would have been brilliant in COVID, because all of the animals transacted now in Ireland are on the phone. So I'm a farmer myself, and you might see me at some Zoom calls. I'm on my phone looking at it. What I'm looking at there is actually my animals being sold, but all the farmer who's purchasing them is looking at is actually the animal itself and its additive genetic merit. So if we could supplement that additive genetic merit with additional effects, as I said, like the heterozygosity and its effect, then it'll improve its usefulness. I've also written down here nutrigenomic effects, and you might think, well, that's stupid. That's real pie in the sky nutrigenomics for animals. We've actually been doing this for centuries. So farmers would buy Angus animals and they'd rear them very, very differently to farmers who buy Charolais animals, right? That's a breed difference, but that's a genomic difference. So could we be more specific? Could we identify Angus animals of a certain genotype and treat them differently to other Angus animals of a certain genotype? And actually that does happen as well. You will get animals that have a delayed age at slaughter. That happens several months prior to that. So what the farmers, it's heritable, age of slaughter is heritable. So what the farmer is really doing is probably segregating the animals on SAR lines, unknown to himself or herself. So that is certainly possible. One of the other things we did develop was return on investment on genotyping, and this completely has to be redone, because any study that we do see on the return on investment to genotyping is purely based from a breeding perspective. So it's looking at selecting females for the next generation, and how does that influence your rate of genetic gain. But I've just shown you for the whole talk that genomics has so much more of a role to play other than advancing genetic gain. So, I thought I had a conclusion slide. Obviously not. Okay. Yeah, look, well, that is the conclusions that what we think, I think the use of genomics for breeding the next generation is really only a fraction of what I believe we can extract from genomic information. Thanks, Martin. Mogens, sorry.
Thanks very much, Donna. And well done with the speed. So any questions for Donna? Yeah.
Hi, Donna. Yeah, one specific question on dairy to dairy mating. If you use a breeding program that would use loci specific information on the genomic information on sire and dam,
what is the or have any idea of the economic value of that over traditional mating programs?
Yeah, I think it'll obviously be a function of the allele substitution effect. So if you are locus by locus, is it a variant that has a small effect, which on average it will be. So therefore, on a locus basis, is probably small. But how I look at this, so because I spend a lot of my time engaging with farmers, it's and pardon my language, but they've often said we've made breeding sexy again. So some farmers could spend days upon days trying to match chromosomes with chromosomes, and it will have absolutely no effect on genetic gain. But what it's doing is getting them to think about it. So breeding delivers around half of the genetic gain or half of the performance gains in most agricultural species. Assuming dairy farmers or beef farmers work the average industrial hours, so 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and if they spend one whole day picking bulls, they spend 0.4% of their time doing something that influences 50% of their profit. So if you can get them to spend a little bit more time focusing on bull selection, then I think you can actually achieve faster genetic gain. Not sure if that answers the question, but.
Thanks, Donna. It's Jonathan here. I nearly believed some of that, Donna. That was so good. So,
sorry, I went over the word. We all know that vets can't count over 5 because they only have 5 fingers. So I may have used numbers more than 5, Jonathan. I'll go through it with you again later.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. So no, two questions. Really good stuff. The first thing is really interesting, the sort of the Nutri-Genomic sort of discussion, because just picking 2 populations of Anguses. So looking at Anguses that are have already had some, say, Holstein genetics introduced to them because they've come from North America, and Anguses which are true breeding, and looking at the difference in calving ease, because certainly we're at a point in sort of practice that I'm involved in that we don't assume that Anguses are easy calving because of those 2 populations. In fact, I did 30 C-sections on a 200 cow dairy herd that had been bred to one Angus bull for that reason. So I think the idea of how they're managed, Donna, if we can, how do we understand those 2 populations? Because then at least we could give advice how we do manage them differently, is one question, rather than assuming that, you know, at the moment people are making breeding decisions based on breed, and actually we do need to go a step deeper because we need to know actually what the breeding is. So that's one question, just whether you expand on that, and I've got one more to follow up if I can.
Yeah, so on that specific point, Jonathan, I was actually hoping I'd have it done by today, but we will hopefully deploy a beef on dairy sire mating advice, if all things go well, next month, to do exactly that, where it'll be recommending the use of big bulls on big cows. So one of the big issues in Ireland at the moment is dairy farmers are just so interested in milk production that they will use a very, very, very easy calving bull who will produce a very, very, very small calf that's worth very, very little. That's okay for their heifers or their smaller cows. But a lot of those farmers have big cows who could take a bigger bull and result in still no calving difficulty, but with a more valuable calf for the beef industry. So what the sire advice is doing is it's looking at not just the genetic characteristics of the cow, but the phenotypic characteristics of the cow, like her parity, her size, and her previous history of calving difficulty, and then using a beef bull, an appropriate beef bull on that will mitigate the risk of calving difficulty, but will still produce a big enough calf. The beauty about dairy beef is that you don't have to worry about inbreeding. While you do with dairy matings, you have to be cognizant of co-ancestry. You don't have to be from beef. So it is very, very easy. And what we do then is we would predict the probability of calving difficulty. Now, we did the genomic variants, gametic variants, for those sires for calving difficulty, and we actually didn't show a strong relationship between gametic variants and variability in calving difficulty.
Thanks, Donna. Just a very quick one, really, really quick, which is just that looking at the beef and dairy beef sort of data, we've picking up data from a supply chain from a retailer now where we've got about 200 farms worth of beef on beef and dairy beef data, looking at basically days to slaughter and outcome data, including emissions intensity. and it'd be maybe really good to look at whether we could sort of look at data sets and stuff on that, if that's okay.
To me, just to follow up on that, right? To me, the lowest hanging fruit globally is age at slaughter. So we have a target set down. It's a little bit higher now after COP, but for every month we can reduce our age at slaughter of our prime beef cattle of 1.27 million, we can achieve 20% of our agricultural target to reduce methane emissions. So if we can reduce our age to slaughter by 5 months, we can hit, just by doing that, we can hit our total agricultural targets. Now, what people, it's really easy to actually achieve carbon neutrality in Ireland, is you just slaughter the calves at birth. That'll do it. But so you have to marry that, the social values versus, well, actually environment is a social value too. So, but age of slaughter to me is a low hanging fruit, highly heritable. Is there management influence? But I think it's definitely something that can be done. And you know what? The nutrigenomics will probably bring you there. The one issue with reducing the age at slaughter is how you get there. So if you do reduce, if you desire to reduce the age of slaughter, and if that requires a greater use of concentrates, which themselves have a higher carbon footprint than grazed grass, then you're actually being counterproductive.
Thank you very much, Donna. So I think that we have to conclude here for today. I think, I hope that the session has sort of brought some information, thoughts to the narrative of how we work with efficiency and resilience. And I also hope that, you know, some of these links across the work packages, so forth, can maybe, you know, continue some of these discussions over dinner and over the beer later on. So thank you very much for this. Just one piece of, some technical information, I think. One second.
I'm sure this information are good for you because I'm talking about food and good time. So since the restaurant is waiting for us at 8 p.m. and the walk will take about half an hour, I would suggest us to meet downstairs about 7